Good afternoon, I'm Thomas Shaw. Welcome to our ongoing series, Catechism of the Orthodox Faith according to the Old Testament. Today I'm coming back around to the issue of the star that we started with in Numbers 24:17. And I wanted to point out that there's a parallelism. There's a star out of Jacob and a man or a scepter that'll rise out of Israel. And these ideas all come together in the development of the idea of the star that we find in the New Testament. That opens the New Testament in Matthew with the Magi and closes the New Testament in Revelation, where Jesus says that I'm the root of David, the bright and morning star. This is in Revelation 22:16. So we've talked about Numbers 24:17. There's also the idea of the root of Jesse, the ideas of like an old tree that has a stump, and how that stump rises up a new growth. All of these ideas of the scepter, with the branch, the bud, and so forth, are all tied in with the star Spica. So this star is associated with the rising, we've just mentioned, which I connected earlier to the idea of resurrection, because the Greek Septuagint translation uses the word a man will be resurrected. So rising, resurrection, it's connected to the idea of the heliacal rising we discussed yesterday of a star. So the name of the star in the scriptures is the branch or the bud. We should look at Jeremiah. I'm going to use a translation from the Hebrew, which I'll explain why in a second. So in Jeremiah 23:5, we have, the days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch. Now the word here is tzemach, which is, many scholars claim, is the ancient Hebrew name for spica. The word means the same thing, basically. So David, a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. So this is obviously coming from Jeremiah at the very end of the reign. He was a prophet, for, as we call, who was with the last Davidic king, Zedekiah, and yet he is prophesying this future king who will come. This is also, I didn't put it up there, but in Jeremiah 33, and this is a verse that does not appear in the Greek. 33:15, he says, in those days and at that time I will cause a righteous branch to spring up. Here we notice the idea here, the springing up, the rising. And he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. Now in the Greek, the idea of the heliacal rising and the idea of the branching and budding are combined in the word Anatoli. It seems to be, when we hear these verses in Greek, for the word branch, they say Anatoli. But Anatoli is also the word for the east. So because the idea of the heliacal rising of stars and the coming, the budding, the coming out of the star, out of the sun of these stars. So the budding of the sun, the rising. So the rising of stars, the sun, associated with the east. In Revelation 22, as I just mentioned, Jesus says, I am the morning star. Now, often this is associated with the planet Venus, which is outrageous. As we know, Venus was the goddess Ishtar, or Astarte in Phoenicia, a goddess really hated by the prophets. So the idea that Jesus would associate himself with Venus is absurd. He's talking about the morning star. He's talking about the morning star of the autumnal equinox. In other words, the morning star of the fall holidays, of trumpets, of atonement, of tabernacles, when the people would go out, as we mentioned, and live outdoors in tents and booths, and would be have much more interaction with the stars. Remember, we talked about at midnight. That's when we find the configuration of Perseus with the lamb and the Leviathan, and we find the cherubim all around, the lion, the bull, the man, the eagle, and so forth. Well, in the morning of those same holidays, they would see rising in the east, heralding the sun, and right on the path of the sun, because Spica sits right on the ecliptic, they would see Spica, the morning star. So the Spica, we remember these words come together in Matthew chapter 2, verse 2, where the Magi say that they see the Messiah's star. We saw his star. Right? Which star? What is the Messiah's star? It's the branching, budding star. It's Spica, rising in the Anatolie. Here's that word again, Anatolie, tying it back into the Septuagint, and tying it into the idea of a heliacal rising. The Spica is rising, and this is in the dative, exactly in the east. Now, I've talked to people, what do they understand when they read this in English? And they think it means that when we were in the east, we saw the star. But that would use the plural accusative in das Anatolas. But this is saying something very specific. Use of the dative implies precision. Spica is rising exactly in the east. And in fact, Spica was moving from north to the east, from a little bit to the north, let's say around the time of David. It wouldn't rise exactly in the east. It would rise to the north of the east. And then by the time of Christ, it was moving slowly, 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 until at the time of Christ, it was rising exactly in the east. And this was a sign that had been given by the prophets and was even emphasized in these translations of translating the word for branch with the word for east, because the Anatolia is a pun that means east or something budding or rising. So Spica moves to the equator, and this movement from the north to the south to the equator is a move. The north signifies, in the scheme of the sky, the heavens, and the south. Remember, we talked about how the deep south signifies the deep and the waters. So in the biblical cosmology, the deep lies under the earth, and the earth is naturally at the point of the equator, exactly east and west. So the movement of the star, Spica, from the north to exactly east indicates it's is symbolic of the incarnation of the Lord, and happens at the time of Christ's birth. So the star is Spica, and Spica is a star that prophetically in its movements told people now is the time. People started looking. In the first century before Christ, the whole world was expecting this Messiah. This this, remember this prophecy of the star coming out of Jacob in Numbers came from a non-Israelite prophet. Josephus tells us that everyone in the world knew that there was a coming world leader who would establish a new rule, and he was to be born in Judah. And was, as other prophecies indicated, when, of course, the Magi don't know exactly where he's to be born, they show up in Jerusalem, having seen a star exactly in the east, and probably accompanied by other signs and miracles. I think my personal opinion is that their vision occurred at the same time as the father of John the Baptist, Zechariah, had his vision in the temple that began the sequence of events of the conception of John the Baptist, the conception of Jesus, the birth of John the Baptist, the birth of Jesus. This all begins with a vision in the temple at when? The High Holy Days, when all the priests would come and serve in the temple. And this is the time when Spica would be rising in the east as the morning star of the High Holy Days. So this is my solution to the problem of the star, and I hope that you find it fascinating and interesting. And I've shown how some of these odd things in the Bible, such as the cherubim and so forth, and now the star, fit together with the holidays of the holiest day of all, the Day of Atonement, in the mind of the people who were writing the Bible, because they could see these things. Remember that the temple was open air. There was no roof except inside the holiest place. There was no roof over the where they were doing the sacrifices and so forth. That would be difficult. So the people out in the courtyards, everybody who come and worship the temple, would be worshiping in the open air, and they would, and so the priests of Jerusalem would have a very good knowledge of the stars, and we do know that even that Babylonian star worship, which isn't what we're talking about at all, because that has to do with the movements of planets. And this has nothing to do with the movements of planets. This has to do with all of these things we've been discussing have had to do with the background stars, not the movement of planets and astrology and predicting things according to where the planets are. There's none of that found in the scriptures. But there are indications that the harbinger of the time of the holidays was the arising as a morning star of Spica. And we might ask, well, why is this? Well, as I mentioned before, in Israel in the north, the main holiday appears to have been Passover. And what's that? It's a holiday you can tell when it's coming because the spring equinox comes, the plants are, the barley is starting to come to fruition, and the full moon is coming. You don't need a calendar. You don't need some official calendar. The sky is your calendar. It tells you when the holiday is. Let's get to Shechem, Samaria, wherever we're supposed to be to celebrate the Passover, to Bethel or wherever they were celebrating it in those days. The same thing in the Southern Kingdom, where the main holiday sequence was in the fall. And we do know that it's probable that in the South they were following what's come to be known as the Enochian 364-day calendar. It's a solar calendar. It's a little short, so you have to interpolate a week every so often. But it was a solar calendar, and why would they be using a solar calendar? Because their main calendar was a stellar calendar. They were going off a stellar calendar. When does Spica rise? With the sun, that tells us it's time for these holidays to be celebrated, and this would tell people from all over the land, as they would see Spica as the morning star, that it was time to head to Jerusalem for the Feasts of the Atonement and Tabernacles. So this provided a practical solution. It kept the calendar constant because they could always interpolate the weeks they needed, which probably every few years they'd have to put in an extra week. They would know when to do this because of how Spica would be in relationship to the calendar. That Spica would have to be rising at the very end of the year for the new year to begin. So this is the star, the idea of the star of Spica. Now, Spica is the chief star of Virgo. And so we have an understanding that there could be some pagan elements that will get mixed up here. We discussed the goddess worship. And when since Spica is right on the track the sun follows, it would appear that Spica was being born right out of the sun. It was as it rise out of the sun day by day. And the sun, in ancient Canaanite, very ancient mythology, was a female goddess. So you had the idea of Virgo. It's the star of Virgo. Why is Virgo there? Because Spica is being born then. The idea of the birth of the star being connected to new life, to springtime, goes back to the time of Adam. And these connections continued, and this is why this particular part of the sky is named the maiden, the virgin, because this virgin gives birth, because in the ideology, as we've talked about, of the temple and the Messiah king of the temple, the king himself is the Son of God. Therefore, his mother is a virgin. And we find this references to the virginity, mainly to the idea of the virgin of the city, that each city had its virgin, because each city had a ruler, and that ruler was in the ideology of those times were sons of God. So this is how all these ideas connect with the star. So I hope I haven't confused you too much. It's been a very brief run through, but I wanted to get to this research of mine on the star in connection with what we talked about yesterday with the cherubim, and tomorrow we'll pick up again with the text of Ezekiel. So thank you for sticking with it. We have a week and a half to go, and I hope you're still having a very blessed Lent. Thank you.